欢迎参与下午第2场的论坛思辨教育怎么做国际案例分析。今天我们将从全球的视角出发，来探讨各国如何实施思辨教育。今天我们很荣幸能够邀请到法国在台协会的学术合作与文化处处长 Cécile Renault 女士。以及来自英国曾任教于诺丁汉大学心理学退休教授 Pete Bibby 先生，他们将各自分享在他们的国家如何推动思辨教育方面的经验与见解。在这边要特别提醒大家，在这个画面上面有口译的 QR code 等等的论坛将以全英文进行，现场将提供即时口译服务。如果需要服务，请扫描会场提供的 QR code， 并使用自备的耳机收听翻译。首先，请让我们邀请法国在台协会的学术合作与文化处处长 Cécile Renault 女士。今天，她将与我们分享法国如何结合文化特色与教育政策的推动，来让思辨教育能够遍布法国，以及这对于学生的批判性思维和创造力有何影响。让我们以热烈的掌声来欢迎她的分享。Let's give a warm round of applause for Ms. Cécile Renault. 我们给他一个更热烈的掌声。
大家好。So I'm very happy to be with you today in this event. I didn't know it, and thank you to the organizer for inviting me. So I'm gonna try to explain why French people are so interested in critical thinking. First, I was asked to explain you a little bit who am I. So I was trained in Sciences Po Paris and in an administrative high school. I also taught, I was a teacher also in Sciences Po Paris later. And I worked in several cultural institutions in France. You may know some of them, such as the Chaillot National Theatre or the Musée du Quai Branly. And then I also worked in administrative, I had administrative positions. I'm a magistrate in the Supreme Administrative Court in France. This is my real job. I also worked for the President of the French Republic on questions related to history and memory of the former colony, French colony. And now I'm the head of culture, education, innovation, research, sports, and perhaps something else I forgot today, at the French office in Taipei. So for us at the French office in Taipei, we are very much involved in this promotion of critical thinking education. So I'm going to explain. So I think the taste, this taste for critical thinking for French, of course, dates back to Greek philosophy. And critique, the word critique comes from the Greek krinian. And krinian is to discern, to sort, to distinguish, I should say. And for Plato, for example, he explained that the philosopher, in fact, is like a butcher. To be a good butcher, you need to know where the joints are. Because if you don't know, you will not be able to cut and to distinguish things. So this is the first, the origin, perhaps, of critical thinking is being able to distinguish and to cut, to make different, Then, of course, the main philosopher for us is Immanuel Kant, whose one of his work, which is possible to read, even for those who didn't study philosophy during lots of years, is what is enlightenment? Because, of course, it's not only Immanuel Kant, but it's also the philosophers of the 18th century. Enlightenment is the idea of being able to think by yourself. And there is a motto which is very often today, even today in France, used, which is a motto of Immanuel Kant. It is sapere aude. So now I skip to Latin. You have the Greek Crinian, and sapere aude is dare to think by yourself. And all the words are important because you have to dare, because it is possible. It's only very often you who hesitate, but you can do it. And then another very important philosopher for France is Jacques Derrida, and he's the one in the 1960s who started to say that philosophy can be taught for very young children and also outside schools, in prisons or anywhere. So I'm going to make a brief stop on Joseph Jacotot, which is not very well known, but the story is interesting. He had to flee from France because of his political ideas, and he arrived in Netherlands, but he didn't speak Flemish, but he has to be a teacher of French literature, so it's very difficult when you don't speak the language. So he chose a book, a bilingual book, and he just said to the students, look and you will understand by yourself, you will learn French by yourself, just, trying to see what's the differences between the sentences in both languages. And in fact, it was a success. So the students could learn a language such as French, which is not easy, as you may know, without teacher, in fact. The teacher was just here to set the frame of the experimentation, and they could learn by themselves. And it is a very important, it's a story which is told by Jacques Rancière in this book, which is one of my favorite books. You can read it in English. It's very easy to read. It shows that the idea is that the teacher is not here just to give his knowledge, but to give the motivation and to be here to, perhaps to make the same journey. And so I'm not a teacher. You will have a teacher later, perhaps he doesn't agree with what I'm saying, but then I'm going faster perhaps. No, sorry. Those are pedagogues. There is another one, which is Célestin Freinet, and you may know Maria Montessori, because I think you have Montessori schools in Taiwan. So it's the same kind of way of teaching, where the most important thing is to adapt to each pupil and to promote creativity. But it's not only in humanities, it's also scientists. For example, we had, because he's dead, Nobel Prize, Georges Charpak, who really developed tools to promote critical thinking in sciences, because you could think that science you just have to learn and to make demonstrations, but in fact it's possible, and it's called la main à la pâte in French, experiences where in fact you have to raise questions and think by yourself, so in science too. So teaching philosophy, because I know that you don't here have philosophy in high school, and sometimes it's a yeah, in France, I think we have lots of European countries. It's not only France, but in France, the philosophy was introduced in school in the 1860s, and it was one of the most important disciplines in high school for the last year of high school. Students may have up to 8 hours of philosophy a week. So it was really very important. And even if you wanted to be a lawyer or a doctor, if you had bad marks in philosophy at the baccalaureate, you couldn't. So it was really a way to see who were the most clever, perhaps, students. And it has changed because now most people don't learn 8 hours of philosophy a week, but still it's an important study. And recently in 2023, we started to learn to implement philosophy as not only on the last year of high school, but the 2 last years, because people used to say, well, only 1 year, it's not enough. I mean, you cannot understand. And I forgot to say that what's important, it's really philosophy and not history of philosophy, which means that students are not told of what Descartes or Kant says, but how to think, and it is very important. So now we have the possibility, students may start philosophy, have 2 years of philosophy in high school, and it's also interesting because they may have, it's common with literature, which means that they select a book, which can be a novel. But in fact, thank you, I'm too long. They try to see that you can read a novel for the story, but also think about this novel. So I just mentioned here several topics which were subjects of the baccalaureate last year, because the main exercise, it is also important, is the dissertation. And the dissertation is not, of course, there is no multiple choice questionnaire in France for the exams, for the baccalaureate. We don't have it. And in philosophy, the idea of the dissertation is that you explain, you are not just opposing, okay, you can say you're for the death penalty, you can say you're against the death penalty. No, it's not at all that. It's a way to go beyond those sterile oppositions and to find solutions, to find ways. So, for example, they had 4 hours to write a dissertation on is happiness a matter of reason? It is possible. And also I mentioned the subjects of the technological series because philosophy is really not only for the best students. So those who will specialize in accountability, for example, they will also have philosophy, but perhaps less hours and with an easier subject. Does art teach us anything? This is not that easy. Just to show you briefly that for the baccalaureate, we still have the mark you will have at the final exam in philosophy will count for 12% of the baccalaureate. So it's still a very important topic. And I wanted to mention the name of Edwige Chirouter. She's pedagogue and philosopher. She created the first and only UNESCO chair on teaching philosophy for young children. And she says that you can start for pupils at 5 years old. It is possible. So you tell them that it's brain gymnastics. You put them in a circle and you can discuss about topics such as what is justice or should we always tell the truth? It is possible, and it is very interesting for the creativity of the young people. Here in Taiwan, and I wanted to, I wanted to circulate a very interesting book which is, the image is here. You have a French philosophy teacher, Charlotte Paulet. She's professor at National Yang Ming Chiao Tung University, very long name for me. And she created an association which is called Philosophy Kids. And the idea is to promote philosophy at school and not only high school. And we will organize each year a philosophy week with her. She organized trainings for teachers, and she will keep on organizing those training with the French office in Taipei, and also conferences. If you're interested, she will have these conferences in October the 3rd. I think I must skip because this one is very important too. It's Michel Tozzi. So it's a method which mixes philosophy for democracy. So it's a way of organizing discussions to on a philosophical point of view, which is understanding the digging into what words mean and distinguishing things, but within a political frame. So young people have different roles. You have the president, you may have, but I'm too long, I know, so I cannot explain more, but you can find also on the web some English content explaining. So we have lots of media and education, democracy education, also mock elections, for example. Yes. So I'm going. So critical thinking is also interesting in history courses because the example I mentioned here is, for example, in France we have a past, a very difficult past of decolonization with Algeria, so that in France today you have people who were enemies, so they fought together, but now they live in the same city, and you still have a kind of, for some people, the wounds are not yet healed. So this is interesting also, that it's a program where former enemies come in class and discuss with the pupils, and in fact it's very interesting because for the pupils they understand that you may have totally opposite ideas and be able to discuss and to explain, and so you understand that in fact things are more complex than you may think at the beginning. So, of course, the need of critical thinking was paramount, but is much more important with AI, because the computers, they will be able to do lots of jobs, but it will be difficult for them to have this kind of critical thinking. So this is a very interesting website, Learning Planet Institute, with lots of resources coming from all over the world on how to learn in a collective way, to promote creativity, more broader, not only critical thinking, but all this way of thinking in the world. And I will take a short example to finish, and I will show you also my, you can flash our QR code to follow what we will do on those topics. But I will take a very short example as regard to AI. You know that, for example, for cars with no driver, I don't remember the real name, you have to train the AI to know, for example, if there are several people in front of the car, is it better to run in, I mean, to kill or to wound 2 old people or 3 young people. You know, this kind of question, which is silly. And it's a kind of dilemma. So today, this is the only way to train automatic cars. I mean, cars with no driver, I don't find the name. And in fact, philosophy tells you that it's exactly not the way you should think. It's not choosing 3 young people instead of, I don't know, 5 old. You have to think differently, and it's really only philosophy which will be able to find ways, perhaps also to train AI to avoid those dilemmas, which in fact are maybe funny, but are not funny at all, and with no good result. I'm sorry, perhaps no, it's okay. Oh, 1 minute left. so thank you very much, and yeah, thank you. I'm going.
非常感谢 Cécile 女士的精彩分享。刚刚我在博客来上面看了一本，刚刚分享一个非常有趣的书，叫做 The Ignorant Schoolmaster。那本书我在博客来看有在卖，所以如果大家有兴趣的话，可以去购买。好的，那么接下来我们将有请英国的 Pete Bibby 先生。Pete 教授在心理学领域有着深厚的学术背景，他将分享在英国如何透过心理学原理来促进学生学习思辨能力。让我们以热烈的掌声欢迎 Pete Bibby 教授。Please welcome Professor Pete Bibby with a full round of applause.
So I'm going to be talking about critical thinking in the UK, mostly from a higher education perspective, but setting it in a context. A little bit about myself. I studied at Imperial College in London, then University College in London, then I did a PhD in psychology and computing at Lancaster. I then moved to Nottingham University in central UK. I was there for 5 years as a researcher and 25 years as a professor. So I was there a long time. I retired about 5 years ago. I taught psychology, but actually what I really taught was statistics and experimental design and conceptual and historical issues in psychology. So it's not really psychology at all, if you think about it. So I'm going to give you a short history of critical thinking education, CTE, in the UK. In the early 20th century, critical thinking education was limited to private fee-based schools such as Bedale, Steiner and Summerhill. Less than 1% of our children goes to those kinds of schools, so it was very limited. In the mid-20th century, the government had an Education Act in 1944, and they suggested that critical thinking education should take place in what's called grammar schools. These are highly selective schools. You have to sit a test, and if you get a high enough score, you can go to one of these schools. Something like 7% of British children went to grammar schools. So again, critical education thinking was limited to a small proportion of the population. In the late 20th century, efforts were made to reform the UK school curriculum so that all the kids in school had some critical thinking education. However, the government didn't give any clear directions to the schools about what they should be doing. Rather, it would be a good idea if we did this. So if you can find time, do, please. Now, all parts of the political spectrum, the left wing and the right wing of the political spectrum, want students to be able to think critically. And as far as I understand it in England, the left wing want you to think critically about right-wing issues, and the right wing wants you to think critically about left-wing issues. Okay. This is the kind of structure of education in UK by age. So kids start school in the year in which they're 5. So that's really quite early, and that's known as primary education, and that carries on until they're 11. And they have what's called key stages, and these are assessed. So you get 5-year-old children being assessed for their reading and maths ability. They are then tested again at 7, and they're then tested again at 11. So these poor kids do an awful lot of tests. And my children did them, and they were not best pleased about this. Then we go to secondary school, and you have Key Stage 3 and 4. By secondary school, we're talking the equivalent of junior high and high school here. And then we go on to sixth form, which is 16 to 8-year-olds. And the form of assessment there is what's known as A-levels, advanced levels of knowledge. Okay. In terms of critical education thinking, most teachers, when they're trained, are told it's worth starting at about 14 to 16. But as I said previously, the government guidance is a bit vague. So some teachers are told to start here at 11 to 14. So there's not a great deal of consistency about when children get taught critical thinking skills. I personally had my kids starting here. So I, over dinner, would sit and chat with them about interesting issues. And my attitude, a bit like Cécile saying, you can teach 5-year-olds to think critically. What are UK teachers told to do? Well, there's a government document which says you need to do these kinds of things. I'm not going to go into detail on any of them. I'm going to give examples of Socratic questioning and show you how you can use that to interrogate children's or adults' understandings of various problems. Right, but from an HA perspective, this has not worked. So even though the goal is to have children thinking critically, we find that the most able students are just as good as they ever were and can think critically. But the least able are much less able than before. There are two main reasons for this. One is government meddling and interference. So governments like to take charge of things and not always in a sensible way. And the second is changes to university education. Why hasn't it worked? Well, in terms of government meddling, in the last 40 years, different governments and different ministers of education, even in the same government, have meddled with UK education. In the last 20 years, there have been 16 ministers of education. It's very difficult to have a consistent policy if the person in charge is changing on an almost yearly basis. The reasoning for the changes that they make or have made in education in schools is usually based not on evidence but personal opinion. And they say things like, it's shocking, 50% of our children are below average at reading. Now, if you apply a little bit of critical thinking, you will realize that that's true by definition. So, there's nothing shocking about half your children being below average at reading. It would be equally shocking to say half your children are above average at reading. All these governments have either inflicted or maintained systems of measurement of school and student performance, and teacher performance actually, that have led to some what I call perverse outcomes. Unintended, not very good ones. Teaching to exams. Schools are evaluated on the basis of how many students achieve the best grades. So a good school, most of the students achieve these high grades. But you can be described as being a not good school if only a few students get those grades. This has meant that lots of schools teach to the exam. Instead of doing more general things like critical thinking education, it's, we've got an assessment, we better make sure our kids do well on this particular assessment. This has also meant that where there's coursework, teachers, their reputations depend on getting good grades for the students, so they very often help the students do the work. Another consequence is the pressure that teachers are under. The average new teacher in the UK lasts 5 years and then quits. Usually to get a much better paid job somewhere else. Because if you can survive 5 years in the British education system, you've done very well. 30% of our teachers leave after 1 year. Also, it's very hard now to attract subject specialists, particularly in the sciences. So trying to find a physics graduate willing to teach physics to 11-year-olds is virtually impossible. So a lot of what goes on is non-specialist teachers are teaching specialist subjects. What about changes to university education? The higher education system, that's universities, have in the last 4 years gone through unheard of changes. When I went to university, 45 years ago, I think, something like that. When I went, 5% of 18-year-olds went to university. A few years later, it was up to 7%, but now, approximately 50% of British 18 to 21-year-olds go to university. This means, just as a statistical consequence of this, that the average ability of a university student has dropped. And because they're not getting the critical education that they're supposed to be getting, their abilities have stayed relatively low, should we say. So they are less well prepared for university level study. A second thing is that although we've increased the number of students, we haven't increased the number of academic staff to the same extent. So now you have far more students and relatively fewer staff. Lots of people think this must be a disaster. I happen to think it's an opportunity. Instead of hoping that students come prepared with a CT, critical thinking skill set, we teach them it. One way to teach them is to use a Socratic dialogue method. At school, I learned but was not taught through example by my teachers using this particular method. And what I learned was to ask when, why, what, why, who, X is true, but more importantly, to ask when it is not true. So you're permanently being asked questions by the teachers. And the questions aren't of the form, is it a good day today, where you can either have a yes or no answer. They're more open-ended kinds of questions. So, this technique works very well at all sorts of levels. You can use this kind of thing with 5-year-olds, because they understand, in fact, are rather passionate about the question why. So you can ask 5-year-olds to engage in this kind of activity, but you can ask 25-year-olds to engage in this kind of activity. So here's an example of something I used to do in tutorials with my students when we were trying to get them to think critically. Ask a simple question like, what color is the sky? So I'm typically A, and B's a student. What color is the sky? Blue. Is the sky blue at night? Don't be daft. Okay, it isn't always blue, so when is it blue? When the sun is out? Are there places where the sun is not out? Oh yeah, the Arctic. So the sky isn't blue there, which is true for about half the year, from about October to March. There's no sunshine. So what else has stopped seeing the sun? Clouds. Of course, the sky isn't blue when there are clouds. So is the sky blue? Sometimes. So the student's gone from what they think is an obvious and truthful answer to a much more interesting answer. And they've had to learn something through answering questions that they're being asked, not being told that they're wrong or anything. You're just engaging with them in a way that encourages them to think a little bit harder about the question. Another question that you can ask is, what is a cause? So what do you think a cause is? Well, it's when something causes something else. Well, yes, but that's a tautology. I don't understand. A tautology is a circular argument. It's assuming the idea cause is the explanation of what a cause is. Okay, got it. It's a bit like saying that the colour red is red because it is red without saying what red is. Yes, that's right. So a cause is when? I don't know where to go from here. I'll give you a hint. If something happens before something else, got it. A cause is if A happens, then B happens, so A causes B. So, does sexual intercourse cause pregnancy? Obviously. So every time two people have sexual intercourse, the woman gets pregnant? Well, no, of course not. So there's not a causal relation between sex and pregnancy. Clearly there is, but do we have to do biology? I didn't come here to do biology. The two conversations demonstrate that by questioning beliefs and assumptions, gaps in knowledge and reasoning become apparent to the student. And the second demonstrates progress in that the student is asking questions of themselves. So here's an example of not very critical thinking. I recently read the following sentence in a Taiwanese newspaper. So Ma bamboo leaves are suited to southern zongzi, which need to be boiled for a long time, and osmanthus leaves are often used to wrap northern zongzi. Now, I've actually separated it out with a full stop, but in the Chinese sentence it isn't. They just flow one onto the other, connecting ideas. I almost immediately had a lot of questions just to try and make sense of that one sentence. I drive my teacher mad by doing this, having lots and lots of questions. So, if you apply a little critical thinking, you might come up with something like this. Ma bamboo leaves, which are not particularly porous, need to be boiled for a long time to bring about the appropriate soft and sticky texture of the rice. But a more porous leaf, the osmanthus leaf, allows for a quicker cooking method, steaming, to achieve the same outcome. I have no idea whether that's true. None. It might be. But that kind of answer is a better statement because it demonstrates there's been some critical thought gone into the sentence. I did teach psychology for a long time, so I thought I'd stick a little bit of psychology in. A critical thinker is, according to Sternberg and Halpern, a person who is careful and analytic, serious about learning, open to different points of view, and who has a healthy dose of skepticism. So to teach critical thinking, you need to get students to have at least some of those qualities. The first thing is, when it comes to thinking, in general, people are fundamentally lazy and basically stupid. Our brains deliberately do as little as they can to get to an answer to a question. So they don't think very hard. They don't like thinking very hard. Motivating students to be curious and wanting to learn is different for each student. So whenever a teacher in a classroom, they can't motivate each student in exactly the same way. Being open to different worldviews is based on personality, family and friends, extended social environment, and culture. So encouraging students to be open-minded when they are not is, oh, there's a bit missing there, not easy. And skepticism in a world of uncertain knowledge is probably a good idea, but too much is probably not a very good idea. My advice, if you want adults who are skilled in critical thinking, get in early, get them young. So start teaching critical education at 5. There's no particular reason why you shouldn't be able to do that. Make asking questions a habit. and help them to develop the habit further to ask questions of themselves. Motivate them, and then help them to motivate themselves so they become independent, critical thinkers. Thanks for listening.
谢谢 Pete Bibby 教授的深刻洞察。So Mr. Pete Bibby has shared such powerful way of practice the critical thinking. What color is the sky? And also Mr. Pete Bibby shared about the 粽子. We can dig just a little bit further. Do you rather choose 北部粽 or 南部粽? So you must be critic, and you will have your answer. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce the next segment of our forum, moderated by Mr. Chen Xiaoyan, the founder of Lead For Taiwan. He will be joined by Ms. Cécile Renault and Professor Pete Bibby. Today, they will delve into integrating international perspective into Taiwanese practice of critical education.
That was fascinating. Wow. Please, let's have another round of applause for Professor Bibby and Director Cécile. Thank you so much for sharing so much about critical thinking history, education in France and the UK with us. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me first give a brief introduction of myself before jumping into our panel session. So my name is Allen, and I spent the first 15 years of my education in Taiwan's public school before having a year of exchange in Russia and finished my high school in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Then I went to study history and economics at New York University, and I spent almost a year in Paris, at Sorbonne and Sciences Po for exchange. And Bob and I founded Lead For Taiwan because exactly we want to bring the type of education we had in the UK, in the US, in France, back to Taiwan. We want to equip every Taiwanese students to have the critical thinking ability in Taiwan with enough resources. And this is why I thank you for being here today, both the guest speakers and the audience, for joining us to discuss my favorite topic, critical thinking education. So here's a bit of rundown for today's agenda. I will begin asking a few questions first, then feel free to scan the QR code, leave your questions, and I will try my best to accommodate your question so the speakers can also hear what you have in mind and what you perhaps would like to ask. So let's begin. The first question, a little bit tricky. You've shared so many great analysis, history, and the know-hows of critical thinking education, respectively in France and the UK. So, based on your perspective, do you think your country has had an effective critical thinking curriculum for the public?
No, of course. Well, I think the question is very large, and of course we are facing in France lots of difficulties in education, and perhaps the most difficult thing is that you need, because it's a passion in France, equality. You know, we had the revolution, we killed the king because of this need for equality. But it has some drawbacks because the teachers need to apply programs everything must be detailed so that we are sure that in the south of France or in the north, every pupil has the same thing. And it is a very big difficulty for teachers because for critical thinking, as we've been explaining, in fact, you will not have really a result. I mean, it's mainly a way of thinking, a way of behaving in group, listening to others, which are very difficult to assess. And also it may be difficult for teachers to do this because it's, of course, we say it's good, it's easy, you can try it with 5 years old, but requires the teacher, in fact, to give the floor to the young and to be able to just maintain, maintain this quality of discussion, which is not easy at all. And teachers are not really trained to that. So I think perhaps those are, I could mention others, but two kind of difficulties for teachers, and then it limits the critical thinking in schools.
I would also say no for the UK. You may have guessed from my talk that I don't think we have been terribly successful. I think there are three reasons, really. One is there is no time in the school curriculum. Everyone has got to pass these exams. So the teachers don't get the opportunity, as much as they would like, teachers do complain about this, to teach critical thinking skills. Secondly, you need to know your area really well in order to ask questions of children. And we've had this loss of expertise. So if you're only getting teachers who last 5 years, then all the expertise of teaching and the domain is continually being turned over, which is fairly disastrous for any kind of education system. And finally, most of the students don't think it's useful because they want to get to university or get a job. And to get to university in the British system, you have to do A-levels. And universities require you to take 3 A-levels. And those A-levels are very demanding. And typically, for example, if you want to study physics, then you're going to do a maths A-level, a further maths A-level, and a physics A-level. There is no room for a critical thinking A-level, even though that did at one point exist. So the students themselves don't see the value in practicing critical thinking because what they want to do is get an A grade in physics, maths, and further maths. So no, I don't think our system works terribly well, and it could certainly work a lot better.
Thank you. Well, I think an important takeaway is that even though in Taiwan we really do look up to France, to the UK for the critical thinking education, they do have their own issues, and we are seeing a similar themes as for how we really lack the time and proper training for the mass public, let it be the teachers, the students, to have the opportunity, resources, and time for the proper training. Then this comes to our second question. In order to have a good critical thinking education, a great evaluation system is also needed. To my understanding, both the French system and the British system requires a lot of writing. But let me give you an example of what Taiwan's education largely is about. Before 2021, the university entrance exam in history only had multiple choices question. And now it's about 80% multiple choices question. It goes like, at what time, what happened, for factual knowledge. And that's for the sake of a very standardized, fair reason. Now, Taiwan is facing an issue with this distrust in, let's say, essay-based evaluation system. What's your point of view on this? How should we convince the parents that essays are a key element of training critical thinking and valuable skills like what you have mentioned?
I think when you teach critical thinking skills, one of the things you're trying to do is get the students to build a knowledge base of connected ideas. And you can't simply ask them an MCQ question to find out what the connections are between those ideas. So in Britain, we tend to use essays. So you'll sit an exam and you might be expected to write 3 one-hour-long essays on different topics related to that area of work that you've been studying. Those essays are built on the very kinds of critical thinking skills that you might develop using things like inquiry-based learning, problem-based learning, Socratic questioning. If I was to say that I was suspicious of this because it's going to be the teachers that mark those essays, then in the UK, teachers don't mark their own students' essays. They mark other students' essays, and it's done anonymously. So the teachers do not know who the students are. Furthermore, when marking these essays, the topics are usually fairly well known. So there's a list of marking criteria. So to get a good grade, the student needs to mention this and organize it in a particular kind of way, etc., etc. Also, the marking is audited. So for every marker, someone looks at the grades, samples some of the marking, and then either says, oh, very good job, or you're being a bit harsh, so we're going to lift your grades up, or you're not being harsh enough, so we're going to drop them down a bit. So if there's perceived to be any bias in the system because an individual teacher perhaps doesn't like your child, then this is removed by this way of doing it. And I can reassure you that I drove most of my teachers mad. Some of them liked me, some could not stand the sight of me walking into the classroom.
Yes, I fully agree, because we have the same method, which, in my opinion, it's not a problem of how to, objectivity is possible, well. But I think what's interesting, once again, is that AI, because, in fact, to be able to write a good essay, you need to practice at home. And now, it's very difficult, because since you can ask ChatGPT to write the essay at home, in fact, you don't learn. So I think we also have to find other ways to evaluate critical thinking. And for example, I mentioned previously this new course we have for before the last year of high school, where in fact the result of this philosophy or critical thinking year may be a video. You can broadcast a video where you explain, I don't know, whatever you want. And here we can really see the process of thinking. I think the most important thing is to be sure that it's the creativity or it's a personal working. So perhaps perhaps the solution is not essays versus multiple choice questions, but it's other kind of exercises we have to imagine. And once again, perhaps you have it, I think now 40 or 50% of the mark for the baccalaureate is coming from the everyday life with the teacher. And one mark which is important is the participation. So if you ask questions during each class during the year, you will have a better mark. And this kind of solution, of course, the parents cannot be sure, that did my child raise the hand, but you have to be confident with the teachers.
Thank you. And I think that brings to the next question, in a sense. Oh, sorry, before that, just to remind everyone that feel free to scan the QR code and ask questions through Slido. I will try my best to accommodate your questions. So take your opportunity. And I would say the next question is, thank you so much for sharing how the philosophy education and critical thinking education look like, respectively. There is a claim saying that, such type of education, inquiry-based education, philosophy, critical thinking, are such an elitist idea that's, for those who have the resources, the time, the energy to deal with. But apparently, in the progression of French and English education chronology, critical thinking also had been going through I would say, series of publication or becoming a mass element. What's your view on this? Do you think philosophy education and critical thinking education are suitable for the mass?
I do. I absolutely think critical thinking is an essential skill, particularly if you're going to continue to university. But I'm a bit biased that way. I spent 25 years teaching in university, so that's what I want my students to be good at, critical thinking. But I don't think it is restricted to universities. If you're an electrician or a plumber, you're going to be faced with problems in your day-to-day work. And you need to be able to solve those problems, and being equipped to solve those problems through critical thinking is going to make your life easier. So I'm wholly for it. I don't think it's elitist. I think it originally was. If you go back to the beginning of the 20th century in England, 1% of our students were encouraged to do critical thinking. Now, if only we have the time, it would be 100% of our students. So any kind of elitism, at least in principle, has disappeared.
Yes, and I think, as we said before, even philosophy, it's not, being able to read very difficult books. It's mainly a method to better understand. And it is very important because we are all citizens. If we were not in democracy, so if only a few people, very healthy people, had the right to vote, okay, we could say those only need philosophy. But here, and it's more and more important with fake news and complotist theories, because it's, every people who will have the right to to vote needs to be able to understand, to distinguish an opinion from an idea, to understand how causality or any and to just think as my colleague mentioned before. You read something in the newspaper, but in fact it is silly because you cannot. I mean, it's not silly, but what does it mean exactly? So it's very, very important, and it's for everybody for sure.
Can I just say I totally support what Cécile said, and in a world where you've got people like Donald Trump about to become the most powerful man on the planet, a little bit of critical thinking would go a long way.
Right. This reminds me of my high school experience. I remember I had all sorts of classmates from my high school. In my history class, there was an Indian minority, there was a French student, there's a Chinese student, and whenever we had like group assignment, whenever I was assigned with a Chinese student, the discussion ends in 1 minute. And whenever I had a assignment with Americans, it also ends, depending on situations, pretty fast. But whenever it was with the French students, I have to spend my whole night just defining the question and the problem. And then, it'll take a while. But then I think that's like both valuable experience. You both have amazing and impressive higher education background. From your perspective and your experience, and now obviously living in Taiwan, interacting with quite some Taiwanese, would you have any advice for parents, teachers, to try to incorporate critical thinking in their everyday life? I remember Professor Pete mentioned a little bit already in the classroom, but what about in everyday life? Are there certain tips that parents, teachers, or even just anyone can do to incorporate critical thinking in their everyday life?
I said earlier I was encouraging my children really quite young to think critically about things. So I gave them a nice little problem. It's an economics problem. I gave my son £10. What's that about? 400 塊. And said he had to give some to his sister. How much he gave was totally up to him. Okay? But if she refused to take the money because she didn't feel, for example, it was enough, then I'd take my £10 back. So he says, okay, I'll give you £4. And she said, no, that's not fair. Dad gave you the money, why should you get more than I do? And he said, well, getting anything's better than nothing. Now, my daughter's 5 years old and he's 8 at this point. I said, all right then. And I gave my daughter, Madeline, the £10 and said, you've got to give Joe, my son, some money. And she said, okay, you can have £1. And he went, that's not fair. And she said, but you said any money's better than none. So that's a 5-year-old girl doing some quite serious critical thinking. She's paying attention to the world. And I think at that age, you can do this kind of thing, and you can do it in all sorts of different situations. What they hear on the radio, what another student says at school, what a teacher says that you don't understand. You can be practicing this kind of critical thinking all the time.
Yeah, I think very young children, they always ask why, and in fact, you don't have to motivate them, but just to perhaps to answer or to tell them that it's good to ask so much questions. But the second point is that I think it's not only the responsibility of parents, because they have their job, they were not trained perhaps themselves, so it's really important that the government really takes the lead and implements some time for critical thinking in classes now, because AI is coming, so it's now an emergency, and you can ask, you can vote as parents, so that this new way of teaching could be implemented soon.
Thank you. And now let's go through a bit of our audience's question, very practical ones. The first one has been one that I believe most Taiwanese teachers face. How do we motivate students who don't like to think or who don't like to engage, especially when competing against the funny TikTok videos and YouTube shorts? Maybe as parents.
I think children are often interested in things in the world. They'll have hobbies and activities that they like to do. If you can, in some sense, problematize those kinds of things that they like doing, then they can be motivated to think about them. How easy that is, I'm just glad I'm not a teacher.
Yeah, perhaps it's difficult, but I think it's once again trying to the idea for the teacher is to show the students that they are not only obeying to any kind of rule which is not clear or why. In fact, I think you need to come back to the why. So why will we learn this or that? And if you're able to ask those questions, perhaps it can be stressful because perhaps you can be stressed not to have the answer, but whenever you give back the power or empower the children, I think the motivation comes back.
So I'm seeing a lot of questions related to the methodologies and tips of teaching critical thinking. I would skip some of them, as I believe in 2 more sessions there will be one panel particularly talking about the know-hows of critical thinking, but I will pick ones that are more related to the international kind of spirit. And here there's an interesting question I see, which goes that since we see that in the UK, the critical thinking education reform happened relatively recent in the past decades. So from your observation as an ex-college student from 40 plus years ago, and all the way when you were in academia, what do you think has the critical thinking education in the UK contributed to the development of the British society? It's a big one.
I think one of the interesting things is that the most able students have always been able to do critical thinking, whether you teach it to them or not. And because we've increased the number of students coming through to university, and they're not being taught it in schools because there isn't time to do it, universities increasingly are taking the role of educating the students in critical thinking. Much to the disappointment of our Conservative government, university graduates are much more likely to vote for the left-wing socially democratic parties than the more right-wing ones. So I think one of the consequences, it's changed British politics. And it's changed British politics by quite a margin, as more people are more likely to vote for social democratic kinds of movements than they are to vote for the more autocratic kinds of movements. So that's one of the big differences I certainly have seen in my lifetime. And it's partly because we've got more students and we are training them better to think critically.
And there's an even more difficult question, but I think it's a question I've also been pondering over for a long time. So the question goes that, well, we know that it's good to train critical thinking and foster philosophers, thinkers in our society. But will that kind of create a culture that prioritizes thinkers over workers? And perhaps there will be an issue related to the economic implications of a society. Though I can give a very short, I guess, hint before diving into our speaker's thoughts, as I would like to give you some time to ponder over that. Just like what we did in the first session this morning, it's quite a universal consensus among think tanks, corporates, and even governments that skills like critical thinking are essential not only for thinkers, but for workers itself, as the artificial intelligence, AI, has really been implemented in the workplace, and having the ability to think critically is an essential element in working with the AI. So regardless of whether you are becoming a thinker or worker or any other thing, you probably need critical thinking to do well in the workforce. But I'm curious about the professor and the director's point of view.
Yeah, you know, recently, I don't know if you have the same case in Taiwan, but in France and in Great Britain, I don't know. In France, we have more and more very highly educated students coming from engineer schools, management schools, or anything. Then they work during 2 or 3 years, and then they think, okay, I don't want to be in those big companies. And some of them choose to new training as, I don't know, to open a bakery, to open a restaurant, to go in the farm. So I really think there is no opposition at all. It depends on what you want to do, and some people really are very happy to be a farmer and maybe to read Immanuel Kant in the evening, but you may have a very, somebody working in a very, using his brain at the highest all day long, and in the evening he will not read philosophy, for example. So I think it's people, they do what they feel like doing, and there is not this opposition.
I don't particularly like the dichotomy, thinkers versus workers. I think everyone thinks and everyone works if they want to generate an income. So I don't think that distinction is especially useful. I like, in fact, as you just said from Cécile, in France, people are going to university, training, doing highly specialized, highly educated jobs, and then saying, I'm going to be a baker, or a plumber, or an electrician. We have exactly the same thing happening in the UK. That people are deciding that they don't want to be part of these big companies where their behavior is in some sense, controlled, increasingly by AI. So they're not choosing to be thinkers in that sense, they're choosing to be workers. But it's required intelligent thought to make that decision, so I find the dichotomy not particularly useful.
Then also a very lively question. Do you think it's appropriate to teach critical thinking with a start from complaining? So I think the question wants to ask, is it appropriate if we begin the kind of critical thinking education or the guidance from complaining, since that's a very common day-to-day habit people have?
Can you give an example?
Jesus Christ, it's Monday again. Why do I have to go to school?
I can honestly say I have no idea what the appropriate response is to that question. Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Is it good to start teaching, let's say, students critical thinking from the point of view of complaining?
Okay. Yeah, why not? I mean, you can start critical thinking with anything. So, okay, you can start on, for example, with the Socratic method just before. Why should it be worse to work on Monday and not on Tuesday? The same sentence could be on Tuesday. But you can also take it as a really interesting start to understand what is working and what is the freedom. I mean, you have lots of questions possible starting from this. So I think you may start from anything. And maybe it's more interesting to start with a complaint because there's a real feeling behind. So, and perhaps a complaint is shared by other people. So I think it's very interesting.
And there's this one I particularly like as well. So imagine if we have a society full of critical thinkers. Everyone think perfectly critical. How would that look like? Is there a utopia of critical thinkers?
I think we already have a society of critical thinkers. People are always arguing with each other about the news, about the newspapers, about the movie they went to see last night, whether or not that meal in that restaurant was a good meal, or was it too expensive and not good enough quality, or could be more expensive because it was really good quality. People engage in these kinds of conversations and debates all the time about every aspect of their lives. Yes, you might be able to get it better in some sense, but I think we already live in cultures of critical thinking.
Yeah, for me it could be, you know, for those who already have been in France or in Paris, we love cafes, you do too, but in cafes we can stay 2 or 3 hours with friends only, you know, debating. So this society would be a huge cafe where people would debate all day long instead of looking at their phone or shopping in the malls. So I would like this kind of society. I think it's great.
Oui, pour moi aussi, for me as well. I think there's also a nice question about, is there any differences in your opinion between thinking philosophically and thinking critically? In the meantime, I'll answer another question first myself. There's a question asking if there's any research evidence showing the benefits of starting critical thinking education earlier. Yes, there has been quite a few research from the UK, from the US, showing evidence of how critical thinking education stimulates the brain development of students, which brings spillover effects, not only to students' language ability, but also logical abilities. So very good for math and very good for language at the same time. I am pretty certain that if you look that up online on Google, very easily they'll come up with quite some university research on this. And if the speaker would like to add anything to this, feel free. Or we can come back to the thinking critically versus thinking philosophically question?
Yeah, on both questions, I think that really I mentioned earlier the UNESCO chair on teaching philosophy from a young age, and they have they try to have also kind of statistics, and they show that it really develops the curiosity of the children and the motivation to learn. And for the first question, but I was not trained as a philosopher, so I may be really wrong. I think that philosophy is broader. Philosophy is a method, is one of the methods to think critically. But of course, philosophy may have lots of other interests, like ethics, or which is not exactly the same. So it's a question, perhaps, of dimension.
I know that there is plenty of research in what's called the developmental psychology literature. So this is human development from children all the way up to adults on critical thinking and its benefits. So that is out there. You have to play hide and seek with it a lot of the time, but it's out there. It's in university publications, it's in journals, it's in magazines. So yes, I would say there is plenty of evidence that critical thinking from a young age helps people develop. In terms of philosophy and critical thinking, I think to do philosophy, you need to be pretty good at critical thinking. But I don't think being good at critical thinking means you need to do philosophy. So I would say they're kind of separate kinds of questions.
And I'll just repeat this again for everyone's sake. I see a lot of great questions about the methodologies of like leading students and how to kind of like balance schoolwork and teaching, learning, critical thinking. I will, I guess, also bring this up. If you like to share, feel absolutely free, but I'm just not certain to what extent you are familiar with the context of Taiwanese classroom settings. So for this question, I would highly recommend you bringing this up in the later sessions when Lead For Taiwan's CEO leads the session. They have plenty of experience teaching critical thinking throughout Taiwan in 30+ different schools, and they have met students from not only conventional schools, but also vocational schools, also elementary schools, and they will have a great idea and methodologies, tips for the actual classroom teaching part. As we have still a little bit more of time, there are still plenty of questions. I think there is one that brings, I think, a critical point of view, which I think fits today's topic. The question goes that, well, since education is a huge industry in the UK, and Professor Pete thinks that the UK has not been doing particularly well with regard to critical thinking, then why do you think people are still longing to go to the UK for education? I know it's very critical, and there's a lot of socioeconomic, political reason behind, and maybe perhaps to do with the colonial past. But Professor.
I think one of the reasons why people go to England for an education at, say, university level is because it's in English. And English is pretty much the world's primary language these days. A second reason is our universities are rated among the best in the world. So I was fortunate enough to study at 2 top 10 universities in London. So I think lots of people want to go to England because it has those kind of universities. And even though education, if you're an international student in London, is expensive, it isn't as expensive as going to Harvard or MIT or Yale or Stanford, those other kind of top 10 universities. So I think there's a real practical issue to do with cost, language, and the actual resources which are available to students if they go to England to study, or the UK.
And then there's a great one. We've heard how Professor Pete told your lovely daughters. How about Director Cécile? do you have any kids? Do you think there's any particular French way of guiding young kids to kind of train their critical thinking on a day-to-day basis? That would be fantastic if we can have this cultural exchange.
Yeah, and it's funny because when I was listening to Professor Pip, I was thinking, how did I do? Because I have, but they're quite old now, grown up. And in fact, I used to speak, to discuss politics with them with a very, very young age, because you know we love to discuss, to debate about politics. And it is possible because young people are really interested in justice, equality, racism, discrimination. So you can discuss about all those topics. And also, I remember when they were young, I was very often telling them, you know, we always read stories, but I was telling them what happened in the French past. So very young, I was just telling as if it was a story, but they knew it was real, what happened during Second World War, why some French people choose to be on the wrong side, and what would we have done, and I was, what would you have done, etc. So it's starting with history or starting with politics. It's very easy to discuss, and they were very interested, and now they love politics, but it's French.
From a psychology point of view, children are really interested in moral problems. Problems of fairness and justice and equity. Children enjoy talking about those kinds of problems. And they're exactly the kinds of problems where thinking about the issues critically is a really good thing to be doing. So I would say, yes, children, why not? I certainly did. I certainly discussed things like the history of the British Empire and the fact that vast wealth was achieved by using slaves. This is hardly an activity that you'd want to replicate in the modern world, and encouraging my children to think about what would be just and what should we do now given that history. So yes, why not? Talk to your children about these kinds of things.
I think there's one last question I would like to end with this great session. So a lot of times Taiwanese struggle between having a kind of argumentative debate, discussion of issues, as we tend to avoid conflict. Are there quick tips, takeaways you offer to the audiences on how do we maintain and set up a great culture, fair culture to encourage debate, but in a nice way, balancing debating and respecting one another?
I would say that critical thinking doesn't mean being critical. So turning around to someone and saying something like, I think what you just said is silly, isn't going to improve the quality of anybody's debate. So being critical of the other person's thinking. Whereas if you engage in dialogue and ask them, why do you think that? Is there a different thing that you might think? How about this? What about this? In that way you can have a relatively civil conversation, even with people who you strongly disagree with. In fact, as an academic, I'm permanently in the business of having civil conversations with people with whom I disagree. So I'll have my theories about how things work and they'll have theirs. And you just have to learn to be well behaved in some sense.
And I would say that's all. And please, let's give an amazing round of applause to our guest.
Thank you. Welcome.
And this will be the end for the session. We should be back in about 15 minutes. And thank you so much.
第二场论坛就此告一个段落。